Beverly Hills, late 1938. The private dining room at the Brown Derby is already heavy with cigar smoke. Crystal glasses glow under low amber light, silverware sits untouched between courses, the laughter is thick, expensive, practiced. Studio executives lean back in tailored suits, publicists smile without showing teeth. A pianist plays softly in the main room outside, but in here the door is closed. Clark Gable is mid-story. He has just delivered the line. A quick one, casual, easy, the kind of joke that sounds harmless if you don't listen too closely. The table erupts. Heads tilt back, a producer slaps the table, someone mutters, "That's our king." A few wives laugh a half-second too late, glancing at their husbands first. Gable smiles, not wide, not arrogant, controlled. He knows timing, he knows rooms. He's been the biggest male star in America for years now. The face of MGM, the box office guarantee, the man audiences trust without question. Across the table, Louis B. Mayer does not laugh. He lifts his glass of water, not wine, water. He rotates it slowly, a quarter turn. The room does not notice at first. Gable continues, leaning back slightly in his chair. He is comfortable here. He has earned comfort. He has made the studio tens of millions of dollars. He has survived scandals, rumors, whispers. He is valuable. He believes he is secure. Mayer sets the glass down. It makes no sound. But three people at the table stop smiling. Because they saw it. Mayer looks at Gable, not sharply, not angrily, just directly. The laughter begins to thin. It doesn't stop all at once, it fades in layers. One executive clears his throat. A publicist stares at her napkin. The pianist outside finishes a melody, and for a brief second there is nothing underneath the silence. Gable notices. He turns his head slightly, their eyes meet. There is no raised voice, no visible irritation. Mayer's expression is neutral, almost paternal. And then he says it. "Clark, remember who writes the stories. That's all. No threat. No insult. No argument. Just a reminder." The room goes cold. Gable's smile remains, but it tightens at the corners, just slightly. His jaw shifts once. He nods as if acknowledging a polite correction. But he understands. Everyone understands. The joke, the line he delivered had been about contracts, about ownership. A passing comment about how some men sign their lives away for 7 years at a time. It sounded like humor. It sounded like charm. It sounded like a man testing the edge of something. And Mayer just reminded him where the edge actually was. Because in 1938 at Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, no one's, not even Clark Gable, was bigger than the studio. Not in public. Not in private. Not in a room like this. The tension doesn't explode, it settles. Dinner resumes. A producer changes the subject to an upcoming picture. Someone asks about box office numbers in Chicago. Laughter returns, but it's thinner now, measured, controlled. Gable speaks less. Mayer speaks normally. But something has shifted. You can see it in posture, in the way Gable's elbow moves closer to his body, in how no one brings up contracts again, in how every sentence now passes through an invisible filter before it's spoken. This is how power works here. Quietly. Without witnesses. Without headlines. The dinner ends as planned, handshakes, gentle smiles, promises to call. Outside, flashbulbs pop as stars leave through the front entrance. Reporters shout questions about upcoming releases. Gable steps into the night as America's leading man, flashing that familiar grin for the cameras. No one outside knows what just happened inside. But inside that room, a line was drawn. Louis B. Mayer had built MGM into the most polished machine in Hollywood. Stars were assets, carefully shaped, carefully protected, carefully controlled. Contracts bound them not just to films but to behavior, public image, loyalty. Gable knew this. Everyone knew this. But sometimes knowing isn't the same as feeling. And that night he felt it. The comment Mayer made, "Remember who writes the stories," wasn't about screenplays. It was about narrative. Public narrative, industry narrative, career narrative. At MGM, publicity departments could elevate a man into royalty or quietly reshape him into something forgettable. Roles could appear, or disappear, scripts could be tailored or withheld, loans to other studios could be granted or denied. A star's image was not owned by the star. It was curated, and if necessary, corrected. Back at his home in Encino later that evening, Gable removes his jacket and pours himself a drink. He stands by the window longer than usual. He replays the moment. The glass turning. The sentence. The silence that followed. He has always projected independence, masculine confidence, a man no one controls. But contracts are paper chains, and paper holds. He had signed one. 7 years, then renewed, then adjusted. Every role, every appearance, every line of dialogue subject to approval. He had power, but it was least power. The next morning at MGM's Culver City lot, business continues as usual. Secretaries type, soundstages buzz, costume designers measure fabric. In Mayer's office, the door remains closed for nearly an hour. Inside, a quiet conversation takes place between Mayer and Eddie Mannix, MGM's powerful general manager, the man who handled problems. Real problems. There are no raised voices there either. Just a discussion about attitude. About future scheduling. About making sure everyone remembers the arrangement. No official reprimand is issued, no memo circulates. That's not how this works. Instead, small adjustments begin. A script Gable had been eager about is delayed, not canceled, just postponed. A loan-out request to another studio is reconsidered. A publicity interview is rescheduled. Nothing dramatic, nothing obvious. But enough. Enough to remind. Because in old Hollywood, consequences rarely arrived as punishment. They arrived as absence. And Gable begins to feel the absence. It's subtle at first, a shift in tone during meetings, a producer who avoids eye contact, a call that takes longer to return. No one says anything about the dinner. No one needs to. He understands. And so does everyone else at MGM. That night at the Brown Derby wasn't about a joke. It was about hierarchy. And in that room, with one sentence spoken softly across linen and crystal, Louis B. Mayer made sure the hierarchy stayed intact. But the real question is what Mayer said. It's what he was willing to do next if the reminder wasn't enough. The first sign wasn't loud. It was paperwork. 3 weeks after the dinner, Clark Gable's agent receives a revised shooting schedule from MGM. A minor adjustment, they say. Production on an anticipated drama has been moved back, not indefinitely. Just until further notice. Gable reads the notice twice. No explanation. He doesn't call Mayer, that would acknowledge something directly, and direct confrontation isn't how power survives at MGM. Instead, he calls his agent. The agent sounds careful, measured. They're prioritizing other properties. Other properties. Gable understands what that means. At MGM, stars are inventory, and inventory can be rotated. The king of Hollywood is about to be reminded that kings can be benched. On the Culver City lot, nothing looks different. Stage doors open and close. Extras wait in pressed suits and gowns. Directors rehearse blocking with quiet intensity. But inside the administrative building, conversations have shifted tone. Eddie Mannix sits in his office reviewing production calendars. Mannix is not theatrical. He doesn't posture. He manages, discreetly, efficiently. If Mayer is the father figure of MGM, Mannix is the enforcer of its practical realities. He has already made 2 phone calls. One to publicity. One to casting. Publicity understands immediately. There will be fewer solo interviews for Gable this quarter. Fewer glowing magazine spreads, nothing dramatic, just a slight cooling. Casting understands too. A prestige script, something layered, something that would have elevated Gable artistically, is reassigned for further development. The role may still be his, eventually. Eventually is a powerful word in Hollywood. It means not now. Gable notices the shift within a month. He arrives on set one morning and senses it before anyone speaks. Crew members are still respectful, they greet him the same way, but producers hover differently. Their tone is slightly more formal. There's less laughter around him. He delivers his lines flawlessly, always has. He remains professional, on time, focused. But professionalism does not erase memory. The dinner lingers. The sentence lingers. Remember who writes the stories. At lunch one afternoon, he sits alone longer than usual. A young assistant director hesitates before approaching him with a minor scheduling request, something that would normally have been handled through a production manager. Why is this coming directly to him? Because someone wants him to feel it. Not overtly, not humiliatingly, just enough to create friction. Power in old Hollywood rarely humiliated its stars publicly. Public humiliation damaged the brand. Instead, it isolated. Gradually. Quietly. At a studio board meeting in early 1939, Mayer reviews projected revenues. Gable's films still perform exceptionally. No one questions his box office draw. But Mayer frames the conversation carefully. We must never forget, he says calmly, that the public falls in love with characters we create. Not actors. Characters. The distinction is deliberate. Across the table, executives nod. No one mentions the Brown Derby dinner, but its shadow is present. Meanwhile, rumors begin to circulate, not in newspapers but in hallways. Gable getting difficult. Contract negotiations might be complicated next cycle. He's pushing for too much control. These phrases are never traced to a single source, they simply exist, floating. And floating rumors are more dangerous than printed ones. Gable hears whispers of them through intermediaries. Makeup artists talk, assistants talk, studio secretaries talk. Hollywood is built on conversations that were never meant to travel. One evening, Gable attends another industry gathering, smaller, less formal. The laughter comes again, the drinks flow. But this time he is careful. Measured. He chooses his words with precision. He tells safe stories, polished stories, stories that flatter the studio machine rather than test it. He has adjusted. Across the room, Mayer observes without appearing to. That's the real pressure. The knowledge that you're being observed. Not monitored, observed. There's a difference. Monitoring feels aggressive, observation feels parental, watchful. It suggests correction is still possible. Gable begins arriving earlier to set, staying slightly later, agreeing to publicity photos he would have previously resisted. No one asks him to do this. That's the point. He understands the currency of cooperation. The prestige script eventually returns to him, but with revisions. The role is slightly diminished, less morally complex, more aligned with the studio's preferred image of him, stoic, masculine, uncomplicated. He accepts. Because declining would create another ripple. And ripples attract attention. Meanwhile, Eddie Mannix makes one more subtle adjustment. A potential loan out to another studio, one that would have allowed Gable to negotiate partial script approval, is quietly shelved. The reasoning is financial. Insurance concerns, scheduling conflicts. Technically true, but also strategically convenient. By mid-1939, the atmosphere has stabilized. Gable remains the king. Mayer remains the architect. The public sees none of it. Magazines print smiling photographs, headlines celebrate new releases, fans line up for premieres. But inside MGM, the hierarchy has been reinforced. And Gable knows it. One afternoon, he passes Mayer in the corridor outside stage 14. They exchange polite greetings, no tension visible. Mayer places a hand lightly on Gable's shoulder. You're doing good work, Clark. The tone is warm. Almost generous. But the hand lingers half a second longer than necessary. And in that half second is the reminder. Approval flows downward. Not upward. Gable nods. He thanks him. And he walks away understanding that the real power in that studio is not measured in applause. It's measured in control over timing. Over narrative. Over access. The dinner at the Brown Derby was never about embarrassment, it was about calibration. A star had leaned slightly toward independence. The studio recalibrated him. Quietly. But pressure like that does something to a man. Especially a man whose image is built on autonomy. Because eventually, the realization sets in. The realization that the crown he wears is ornamental. And that realization doesn't disappear when the cameras roll. It follows him home. It follows him into mirrors. It follows him into silence. And silence in Hollywood is never empty. It is waiting for the next test. By the summer of 1939, Clark Gable stands on the set of a film that will define his career. Gone with the Wind. The production is not MGM alone, but MGM is deeply invested. David O. Selznick may be steering the picture, but Louis B. Mayer's influence runs through every corridor of the deal. Gable's casting as Rhett Butler had required negotiation, pressure, and strategic maneuvering between studios. And now, as cameras roll in Atlanta heat and on Culver City soundstages, Gable carries more than dialogue. He carries awareness. Rhett Butler is a man who appears independent, defiant, untamed. Audiences will believe that performance completely. But behind the scenes, Gable knows better. He hits his marks, he delivers his lines with precision, he commands the frame. And yet, in quiet moments between takes, there is a new stillness in him, a calculation that wasn't there before the Brown Derby dinner. He no longer tests boundaries casually. He no longer improvises comments in rooms filled with executives. The recalibration worked. Not through confrontation. Through demonstration. Gone with the Wind becomes a phenomenon, a cultural event, one of the most successful films in history. Gable's image as the king of Hollywood solidifies permanently. But something subtle has changed in the relationship between star and studio. He understands now that admiration does not equal autonomy. Box office power does not equal leverage. Because the studio controls more than casting. It controls memory. Public memory. The public will remember Rhett Butler exactly as MGM allows him to be remembered. Interviews will be framed, stories will be shaped, anecdotes will be selected. If a star strays too far from the curated version of himself, that curation can tighten. And Gable saw how quickly it could tighten. In the years that follow, he becomes more disciplined in public, more guarded in private gatherings involving studio leadership. Friends notice it not as fear, as restraint. He laughs differently around executives. He chooses stories carefully. The king learned court etiquette. Meanwhile, Louis B. Mayer continues to build MGM's empire. He refines the star system with almost paternal rhetoric. He refers to actors as his children. He speaks publicly about morality clauses and public responsibility. But behind closed doors, the language is simpler. Control. In 1942, when Gable's wife Carol Lombard dies in a plane crash, the tragedy shatters him. The studio moves swiftly to protect his image during grief. Public statements are managed. Press access is regulated. Even in loss, the machinery operates. Gable enlists in the U.S. Army Air Forces during World War II. It is a personal decision, a patriotic one. But it is also a moment of independence. For the first time in years, he steps outside the studio's immediate orbit. Yet even then, MGM maintains narrative proximity. Newsreels frame his service as heroic, noble, consistent with his on-screen persona. The studio writes the story. Just as Mayer said. After the war, Hollywood begins to change. The studio system's grip weakens under legal pressure. Antitrust rulings loom, contracts evolve. But the culture of quiet control lingers. Gable eventually negotiates more favorable terms, more freedom, but the early lesson never fully leaves him. Because power experienced once is never forgotten. Especially when it is delivered without shouting. In 1951, Louis B. Mayer is forced out of MGM after internal corporate shifts, the patriarch removed from his throne. Hollywood headlines focus on business politics. Few reflect on the decades of subtle authority he wielded. By then, Gable is older, established beyond question, the king without dispute. But kings age. And institutions outlive individuals. Looking back, that dinner in 1938 does not appear in biographies as a turning point. It isn't dramatized in memoirs, it isn't cited as scandal. It was too quiet for scandal. Too subtle for headlines. But it was a moment when the illusion of autonomy cracked. When a man at the peak of fame was reminded in a single sentence that the story of his life could be shaped by someone else. Remember who writes the stories. Mayer was not threatening to end Gable's career that night. He didn't need to. He was reminding him that careers in Hollywood are not destroyed loudly. They are redirected, softened, delayed, and sometimes simply allowed to cool. The fear in that room was not about anger. It was about access. Access to roles, to publicity, to longevity. Gable adapted because adaptation meant survival. And survival meant remaining the king. But the crown never fit the same way again. When Gable died in 1960, the tributes described him as strong, independent, self-made, a man who embodied American masculinity. None of those tributes mentioned the machinery behind that image. None mentioned the rooms where laughter stopped midair. None mentioned the quiet sentence spoken across crystal and linen. Because the public story had already been written. By the studio. By the system. By the men who understood that control exercised softly is control remembered longest. That night in Beverly Hills did not end with a fight. It ended with compliance. And compliance in old Hollywood was the most valuable performance of all. The cameras never recorded it. But everyone in that room carried it with them. A smile. A glass turning a quarter inch. A single sentence. And the understanding that in a town built on stories, the most powerful people were never the ones in front of the lens. They were the ones deciding which version of you the world would see. The dinner ended. The king remained. But from that night forward, he never forgot who wrote the story. And neither did anyone else. Silence can be louder than applause. In that room in 1938, silence won. And it never really left.